And we'll go ahead and get started here in just about a minute for those of you that are still funneling into the workshop. Thank you all for being here. All right, let's see. We got a whole bunch of some people, others in California, Buenos Aires, Florida, Boulder, Colorado, London, not directly behind me. James, that's funny. Seattle, a whole bunch of places. David, you met Sam last night. Very cool. Yes, he was just in this room somewhere around here. All right. Well, there will be more that that do continue to come in. That's fine. Just as a, before we get started, this is going to be recorded. We're actually live on, X, YouTube, LinkedIn, a few different places. So it's available. You can go find it on our YouTube directly following this. So if you have to leave, if you miss something, you can grab it on our YouTube, and you can we'll share all the links and the resources as well following this event. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen here. Give me 1 second to get everything pulled up, and we will get started. All right. So thank you all for being here. Today we're going to learn a little bit around how to build our first agent. We're going to use Mastra. We're going to talk a little bit about MCP as well. And this is interactive, so please use the chat. There's also, I believe there's a Q&A section. You can use that if you have very specific questions. But for basic chit chat, the chat is fine. We want it to be interactive. We want you to ask questions along the way. We'll try to save some time at the end for questions, but we do have a lot we're going to cover. So we're going to talk through quite a few things, but our goal is we're going to walk through kind of building a simple personal assistant agent with Mastra, and we're going to use MCP. So if you're not familiar with MCP, we're going to cover what that is as well. So the things that we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about what are AI agents. We're going to talk a little bit about what MCP is and how does that, what does that matter? How you actually go out finding MCP servers to use with agents that you might be building, and then how you can use MCP and Mastra to build this somewhat realistic personal assistant agent that can do a number of tasks for you. It's a good starting point if you're just trying to learn a little bit more about building agents. So who am I? I'm one of the co-founders of Mastra. I lead a product over here. I was previously at Gatsby and Netlify. I built a site called AudioFeed. I spent many, many years in open source software, dating back to doing a lot with Drupal when I first got started, a lot of web development. And yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn or X. So first, what is Mastra? For those of you that are maybe new, have not used Mastra yet, it's an open source AI agent framework for TypeScript. It has agents with tools, memory, tracing. It has workflows, so you can do the human in the loop workflows, and it's a very simple API to make it really easy to build more deterministic workflows. We have evals that allow you to kind of track and measure AI output. We allow storage for RAG pipelines for you to get, basically how do you like get the right context into the LLMs, into your agents. And then we all package it up into like a local development playground to make it really easy to iterate and test these things. And you'll see that quite a bit today. Whole idea around Mastra is we want to be opinionated at the beginning so you can get further faster, but it's flexible. So you don't ever feel like you're locked into the doing things the way that the framework tells you it has to be done. So we really want to make it very portable where you can kind of piece in different components as you build out your application, as you grow, so you never really get locked in. But let's talk first, like what are agents? There's a ton of definitions for agents, and I don't think there's necessarily a right one. A lot of people will will have say you shouldn't call workflows agents, you shouldn't call this an agent. The simplest answer is an agent to me is software with non-deterministic code, meaning that you don't know, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen. And if you use an LLM, you wouldn't if even if you use ChatGPT and you've asked the same question multiple times to ChatGPT, you know that you're never getting the same answer, right? So that is very non-deterministic. It's hard to predict exactly what you're going to get out of it. And so that's like the very simplest version of agents, but I do think there's what we like to call like the agentic spectrum. And something that's maybe less agentic is it's almost all deterministic, and there's maybe a few calls to an LLM. Maybe like a trip planner where first you find a hotel, then you find a flight, or vice versa. First you find a flight, then you find a hotel, and it's very like step by step. There's maybe a few points that are less deterministic. That's less agentic. Something that's more agentic is you allow LLMs to build and execute their own plans, and they have access to different tools. So this could be maybe like an AI customer service assistant with access to your knowledge base. It's a little bit more autonomous, but um, so it's a little bit more agentic. And then something that's even like kind of on the further end of the spectrum would be, like the Waymos or the self-driving cars, right? It's mostly autonomous, runs with very little human input. And so you have this like spectrum of what is an agent or how agentic is a system. And so in Mastra, we do give you kind of primitives that map to some of those things. We have workflows, which are more deterministic. We have agents, which is what we're going to kind of cover today, which is kind of somewhere in the middle. You can give an agent tools. It can make decisions based on what you ask it to do, and it can use those tools that it's given. And then we also have this concept, which we won't cover today, called agent networks, which is like a collection of these agents working together, mostly, potentially autonomously. So we are going to talk a little bit about MCP, and I I'm curious, if you have any experience with MCP, but it's essentially a standard that allows LLMs to connect to other systems. So the idea was, there are a lot of APIs, a lot of data sources out there, and we want to make it easy. There's some kind of standard for the agents that we're building or the LLMs that we're using to get data from these different systems. So it's kind of like a USB-C port for AI applications. It's a standard. I don't think it's necessarily a perfect standard, but it is a standard that a lot of people are starting to agree on, and that because of that, it now unlocks a lot of things. So we are going to talk a little bit about what MCP is. And when we want to talk about exactly how it works, there's this MCP client. If you've used Cursor or Windsurf or maybe Claude Desktop, I think ChatGPT was even going to release like MCP support. I don't know if that's officially launched yet or if it's just coming very soon. But there you have this idea of a client, and it uses the protocol to connect to some kind of MCP server. Now, the interesting thing about an MCP server is this could be a remote MCP server that you're connecting to, and maybe it goes out to GitHub or to Slack, or it could be a MCP server that's actually still running on the same machine as the client, but it uses the protocol to know how to actually communicate. So the server is essentially a bridge to various pieces of functionality. We're not going to spend too much time on the MCP spec, but there's a couple different things that are interesting about the spec. The spec has this idea of tools, which is where we're going to spend all of our time today. Tools are basically actions the model can call. Basically, they just think of it like JavaScript functions that your model can call and run code. That is the most MCP servers just define tools today. Even most MCP clients really only support tools. I think VS Code just announced that they're the first editor to fully support the spec, so they support prompts and resources and all the other things that come with it as of today. The spec is still changing, of course, but most clients don't support the entire spec yet. I think over time they will, but for now, most of them just really focus on tools. There's also this concept of prompts, which are like message templates. So you could almost like if you think about you're chatting with your Cursor agent, you can get suggestions for what you might want to prompt your server, like what kind of prompts that the server can handle. Resources are like data sources. So it could be a file URL or some kind of data source that is going to be consistently updated, and your agent or your LLM, your client will have access to. And there's a few different kind of transports. the two common ones are standard input output, STDIO, or streamable HTTP. The easiest way to think about this is like STDIO is essentially like a running locally, typically on with alongside your client, where streamable HTTP, you're going out to some API somewhere and you're going to stream the results back. There's also another one called SSE, but it's pretty much being replaced by streamable HTTP, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. It solves a lot of the same problems. Okay, so how are companies trying to use MCP? They're using MCP to connect agents with their internal systems. So like internally, if you have some data sources, you can build an MCP server, and now your other internal teams can access data if they're building agents with from those data sources. There's a lot of dev platforms that are obviously adopting MCP mostly as clients. We mentioned Cursor, Windsurf, Klein, VS Code, all these different tools. Claude Desktop supports it, ChatGPT supports it. And there's also like a growing list of connectors or servers that allow you to connect to things like Google Drive or Slack or GitHub, some kind of database. And we see a lot of people starting to build MCP servers. Linear, I think, has an officially supported MCP server. So uh, service providers are building MCP servers to allow you to basically access their API. At Mastra, one of the things that we're doing is we have an MCP doc server. So that we found one of the problems that a lot of people, as they start building AI agents with Mastra, they need to follow specific, using our APIs, right, to build these agents. And the typical way you would do that is you go to the docs, you read about it, you copy and paste code snippets in. But with these new code editors, you want to be able to just ask Cursor or Windsurf or whatever you're using to write some of the code for you or to teach you how to do it. But it wasn't aware of Mastra, right? Mastra's still relatively new, and the models are trained on data that is in the past. So we created an MCP doc server that always has up-to-date information. So if you install it inside Cursor or whatever your editor is, and you ask questions about Mastra, it now has access to all the documentation so it can write Mastra code for you. And within that MCP server, we also offered this, which we believe is the first time anyone's done this. I'm not exactly sure, but this idea of a course. So you can essentially, inside Cursor, tell it to start the Mastra course, and then your Cursor agent will actually walk you through how to implement a lot of what we're going through today, like an example, similar type of example where it'll actually teach you how to build an agent, how to add memory, how to add tools, all those things. But it walks it through in the chat interface, so it's very interactive. So there's a lot of different use cases for how you could actually use MCP within within these different MCP servers. So are there any examples of MCP implementations using OAuth? Yes, there are some. So some of these, and we'll use Zapier's MCP, and there is like an OAuth component to that, but that happens outside. If you want like your users to go through OAuth, that is a little less defined. So it's very easy for me to OAuth myself and give that access to an agent. That is easy. If you're building an application where you want your users to then OAuth, and then the agent that you build can access that user's data, there is more complexity to that. There's a proposal in the MCP spec. I think it's in draft state still, at least last time I checked, or more around like a more specific ways of implementing auth. I think is, very much kind of piggybacked on the idea of OAuth, but there is some stuff coming in the MCP spec around how to facilitate this auth and make that a little bit better. Let's see. When I tried to use a tool with Prisma, my agent was hallucinating the response and selecting a randomly reply. Daniel, it's hard to know for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if if your agent is hallucinating. It's actually one of the challenges with working with some of the stuff. I will, as we go through today, maybe, I'll highlight a few things that could be the case of where that could be kind of going off the rails, but it's hard to know for sure. The Apollo GraphQL, David says the Apollo GraphQL MCP server is amazing. You can turn your GraphQL backend into an MCP server and get access to queries and mutations. Yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, there's a number of these like MCP servers, I still see it mostly with helping developers. That's where the most adoption is, but it's starting. I think there are more and more implementations that are starting to get a little bit more mainstream, not just like helping us as, developers or engineers day to day, but potentially getting, you know, especially now that ChatGPT is going to be implementing MCP within their app, right? That'll make it a little bit more mainstream. But yes, it still is there's a lot of really cool developer tool implementations. One of the things that are the challenges is there's a ton of MCP servers. How do you find them? You need like a package manager, what's called an MCP registry. There's ones like Zapier, Composio, Smithery, MCP Run, Graphlet, OpenTools. There's way more than this. There's so many that we actually created an MCP registry. So on the Mastra website, you can find our registry, which just lists a whole bunch of different registries that are available to try to help people search through the various options. They can find one that helps them get started fast. And if there's any that are missing, you can definitely in our open source repo, you can PR this and it'll get updated on our website. So yeah, there's a lot. Question here, MCP seems to have won, wondering what we think about A to A. I think, there's two ways to look at it. You can look at them as competing standards, in which case I would say MCP is as one in that regard. I don't think MCP was originally designed to be agents to agents talking, but it can work that way. So it can solve some of the same problems that A to A solves. A to A was much more designed for just agent to agent communication. We at Mastra, we support both because we don't know what standard is going to win. So we want to make sure that you can use whatever standard. And if A to A gains more popularity, your agents, if you build an agent with Mastra, you can expose it as an MCP server very easily. And it also supports A to A. So the idea is to make it very interoperable. But I would say like A to A hasn't quite picked up the way that MCP has. So, but we do support both. And then there's AGUI, yes, also supported by Mastra. AGUI is much more tuned toward connecting front ends to agents, but yes, there's a whole bunch of these new standards, right? Like the ongoing joke is, you know, there's too many standards. We need to invent a new standard to, solve this problem of too many standards, and then you have one more standard. So I think, the space is still very new. We're still gonna, figure out over time what really wins. But let's actually, what we're here for. Let's write some code. So I'm going to go through a very simple example of creating a Mastra agent. And we're just going to go from the beginning to like getting something working with Mastra. And then we're going to look at a more built out agent, give that agent access to our email and social media, allow it to access GitHub. And then we should have time to hopefully show how if we wanted to wire up a different front end, in this case, I'll show you how we use like Telegram bot to talk to the agent. And if we have some time, I'll also show you some ways you could deploy this agent. So let's go ahead and get started there. There's one question. All right, so what are the benefits of Mastra when compared with LangChain, especially LangGraph? Is that feature parity, generally speaking? Yeah, it's often compared to, like, we like to think of Mastra as like if you took LangChain and LangGraph, put them together, that you'd get a lot of the same things with Mastra. I don't know that they have everything we have or we have everything they have, but there's quite a bit of feature parity between the two. I think our workflows are very closely aligned with what you can accomplish with LangGraph. And then we have some other things that are kind of built on top of it that are give you a little bit more structure, I believe. But we often get compared to LangChain and LangGraph. I think one of the biggest challenges that we hear from our customers is that maybe the LangGraph docs. I think LangGraph was very good when it started in Python, and then it also now has JavaScript implementations. And sometimes we actually in the past had used LangGraph and often find that it was hard to find the right docs. You often would end up on the Python docs if you're using JavaScript. Or if you wanted to use Python, sometimes you'd end up on the JavaScript doc. So I do think that our opinion is frameworks should stick with one language. And so we're just TypeScript, JavaScript first and only. But we do accomplish a lot of the same things. So there is quite a bit of feature parity between the two. All right. All right. So why TypeScript? Good question. Does it I think the idea that you should build AI with Python made sense at the beginning because it all came back from like the machine learning data science world, which is very Python centric. And if you're going to train models, if you're going to, do reinforcement, fine tuning, you're probably going to be writing some Python. But most of what we do day to day is not fine tuning, right? We have these LLMs that are just available through APIs. And if there's one thing that JavaScript and TypeScript developers are good at, it's interacting with APIs, right? If you come from a background in the web world, writing a lot of JavaScript and TypeScript like I do, then interacting with APIs is pretty second nature. And so I think the type safety out of the box is really nice, especially when you're writing code. You don't have to add any extra, libraries to get type safety. So TypeScript does help with that. It kind of enforces a little bit more structure and a little bit more of a standard. But again, we're kind of TypeScript. We're a TypeScript team, so we're a little bit biased. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get going because there's a lot of questions. Hopefully, we'll answer some more as we go. But let's actually share some code. All right. So I'm going to just go to the Mastra website and I'm going to copy just this. We're just going to run this from the beginning so we can see what building a really simple example agent looks like in Mastra. So it's going to say, what do I want to name my project? I'll just call it June 18th. And this is going to go out. It's going to install all the NPM packages that are required for Mastra. And it's going to ask me a few more questions. Plans to expand the client SDK to other languages. It's a good idea. We don't have any immediate plans to do it though. So right now it's just the Java our client. So you have the client that can interact with your master agents. Right now that is just in TypeScript. Where should we create the master files? Let's just keep the defaults. We'll use OpenAI, but we could use, any provider. I will paste in my key separately, so I'm going to skip that. And while we're setting up this agent, it asks if we want to install the Master Docs MCP server in our editor. That way we can ask questions and have it help us write the code. So I'll go ahead and do this. Just we'll use cursor. And so if I go into this project and I am going to just copy in my environment file, remove the one that came with it. And now I can go ahead and just run npm run dev. And this will fire up our local development playground. So out of the box, when you go through this kind of getting started experience, it does give you an example agent so you can see the code, see how it works. So you can see I have an API I could hit with some kind of API client, or I can go to our playground. So we're going to go to the playground. And there's a whole bunch of things here. We're not going to cover all of it, but I encourage you to check it out. The important thing is we have this weather agent. So if we click into this weather agent, you'll see there's kind of a lot going on, but we have a history of a chat history of this agent. We can actually live chat with this, so we can test it. We can iterate on it quickly. It tells us here's the system prompt or the instructions for this agent. So you can see you're a weather assistant. You can do a few things. It has access to this weather tool. And I can configure model settings as I'm testing this and do a bunch of other things. But just to test this, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I haven't been outside yet today. So what is the weather in San Francisco? You can see it calls the weather tool, and then it gives me the weather. What is that? What's that in Fahrenheit? So a little cool today, but I'm assuming it'll get a little warmer pretty soon. So you can see I can chat with this agent, I can test it. I can now go and see traces. You can see anytime I chat with the agent, I have this trace. So I can look at this. You can see that the types of tools that it calls. It made this tool call and got this result. So you can see it called a tool, and here's the actual system prompt. the response, all the messages that basically, all the data that's passed back and forth between the LLM and the user. So you can actually dig in and see quite a bit of information about what happened in this request. And let's actually look at the code and see how this works, because I think that is kind of the most interesting piece. Like what code did we have to write in order to accomplish this? So if we look at this, and I'll make this just a touch bigger. In this source folder, which is where we told it to put all the code, there's this agents, tools, and workflows subfolders. So you can probably guess how that corresponds because it kind of ties to the playground UI that we saw. If we look at this weather agent, it's pretty simple. There's really not too much to it. We are exporting a new agent. It's called weather agent. We gave it the instructions, which we saw in that playground UI. We tell it what model we want to use. Mastra is built on top of AI SDK, so you can bring any model that AI SDK supports, which is almost all of them. And you can even support any other model that has the open AI compatible APIs, which are almost all of them. We are adding this tool called the weather tool. We'll look at what the code is for that. And then we are adding just a simple like local libsql memory. So the idea of memory is I can continue to chat with my agent and it knows the past conversations that I had, right? So I could ask the second question of well, what is that in Fahrenheit, and it knows what the previous conversation was, so it can answer that. And if we want to actually look at what the tool is, a lot of these are just uh, TypeScript types, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. In this section here, we're creating a tool called getWeather. The tool description, if you are building agents and you're having trouble with your agent not calling the right tools, the description in the ID and the description are the most important parts. The reason being is that the LLM can only see that. It sees that description and it needs to know, based on that description, should I use this tool or should I use a different tool? So especially as you add more tools, the descriptions become very important. You should be able to hand these tools over to an average human and know that that person could, based on your request, answer the question or call the right tools. If an average person would struggle, an LLM is definitely going to struggle to call the tools in the right instance. So tool descriptions are very important. This one's very short. If you have more complicated tools, you may need to increase that description, add even like small examples. There's a limit, I think, on the size, but you'll likely have much longer descriptions. This tool has an execute function, which just calls getWeather. And if we look at what getWeather does, it's basically making two API calls. The first is it takes the location and it geocodes it. So it goes out to this geocoding API, gets the latitude and longitude, and then it calls another fetch call to this weather API with that latitude and longitude to return the weather. And we just return it in this structured format. So the tool basically has this definition of this wants this exact output. Here's what the input, here's the output. And that way, the LLM, your agent, when it's calling it, it knows what output it's going to get back. So then it can process that output and then formulate a response. All right, so we got a couple questions here. Let's see. Is it okay to use ppm or pmpm? Yes. In my other example, I'll use pmpm, but you can use any yarn, npm, whatever. It all works. So are the API endpoints part of the playground or are they part of the actual app when deployed? So that's actually there's a lot to that question. So Terry, that's a great question. So when you're running dev, you have those API endpoints. You can deploy Mastra as a standalone application, and then you have access to those API endpoints. You can then use the Mastra client or just plain fetch or curl or postman or whatever, and you could hit your deployed agents. So yes, when you actually deploy it, you have access to those endpoints. But it doesn't have to be deployed as a standalone application. At the end of the day, this is just JavaScript and TypeScript. So if you have a Next.js app, you can bundle Mastra in your Next.js app so you don't have to necessarily deploy them separately. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you want to deploy this. We see that a lot of people do like the separation of concerns where their API or their AI application is deployed separately. They interact with a front end, whether that's a mobile app, a desktop app, a web app, whatever, through the API. But in some instances, you want to just bundle it together into a single application and you want to deploy it in one place. And so then maybe if you're building, let's say it's a Next.js app, you're calling directly to these master agents in your server functions. Something like that is possible. Um, and do you have to put in your own API key to use the models from OpenAI? Yes. So I'm not going to show it, but I have this .env file. It created an example. I just had to paste in my key. So I could paste in my key when I was creating the agent through the command line, or I could just go in it later and just copy in with the right environment variable key. So yes, you do have to provide your own key. If you're using Anthropic, you'll need a key from Anthropic. If you're using OpenAI, you'll need an OpenAI key. Gemini or Google, you need a Gemini key. Is there a way to use AWS Bedrock? Yes. AI SDK supports that, so you could use that. Is there a GUI to tinker with those agents, tools, etc.? Well, we have the playground. I think that's what you mean. In the playground itself, you can actually, one of the things that I like, uh, we're not running it, so need to turn it back on. One of the things I like once it's ready, takes a few seconds. There it is. You can test the tools in isolation. So any tools you create, I can just test this tool. Oops, I didn't want to click on that. Let's just test the tool. And I can type in a city. In this case, I'm from Sioux Falls. I can see what the weather is there, and it returns the structured response. So the pattern is often build the tool, test the tool in isolation, make sure the tool gives you the result, hand the tool to the agent, and then make sure that with your instructions that you give the agent, so in this case, it tells it how to call the tool and when it should call the tool, it knows how to use that tool. So that's often the pattern. Do you need to use Master Cloud to use the GUI on a deployed server? Carlos, if you use Master Cloud, you get basically this playground on your deployed agents. Some people have tried to like the playground's open source, so you could try to wire it up yourself. You'd have to figure out like how do you deploy it, how do you point it at your running agents, but it is possible. But there's quite a bit of like manual setup if you want to run your own deployed version of Playground. Um, Is it possible to load things dynamically? I think the answer to that is yes, but we might need to unpack that. And is it possible to use local models? Yes, you can use local models too. So we're actually talking with LM Studio, which is a popular way to run local models, but they have an AI SDK provider. You can run and route through a local model. And yes, you can run this whole thing locally where you don't even have to go out through an API. All right, so we have about 25 minutes, which is great. That gives us enough time to dig into a little bit more complicated example. This was a good, like very basic example of an agent that has access to memory and has a single tool with pretty basic, pretty simple instructions. Now let's look at a little bit more of a detailed example. So and the code for this personal assistant agent is available. So it's on GitHub. You could find it if you go to the Mastra AI GitHub, but we can actually dig through this. So let's run this thing so we can see what it can do. We'll actually do the demo of it, and then we'll spend 15 minutes digging through the code. I don't think we'll really be able to dig into everything around the code. So I would encourage you to explore the actual GitHub repo if you want to like figure out, because we might have to breeze over some of it just for time's sake. Yep, thank you for sharing the link. Yes, OpenRouter is also supported. Um, yep, and should Master choose which tool to call? So Ramiro, that's a great question. I'll try to touch on workflows briefly. If you have two options when you're when you want to make decisions on how to call these tools. If you have a very specific set of instructions, where you know that first do this and then maybe you do one of these other two things, but it's always in this very specific order, I would encourage you to use workflows because you're going to get the most accurate results because it's much more deterministic. If you need to handle more maybe obscure tasks that are a little bit more open-ended, having an agent that can have a selection of tools and then choose between those is the way you can go to kind of accomplish that. So you have a few different possibilities. And honestly, like you could have an agent that actually calls into a workflow, or your workflow could actually call out to an agent for one specific step. So these are pretty composable that you can kind of intermix these to come up with some pretty complicated examples. All right, so let's go to this one. This one again is a little bit more built out. So we have the weather agent that we showed in the last example. I have this one I'm just calling MCP agent because it has access to just a few things. And if you look at the instructions, it has access to Gmail, to GitHub, and to Typefully. So in this case, we're using two different types of MCP servers. I'll show the code for how this works. But to start, let's just say draft me a tweet that says hello from the workshop. So we're going to let this thing run for a second. And it's going to do this through, we use Typefully, and we're using Zapier. I'll show you how I set all this up here in just a second. And if I go to my Typefully, you can see I just got this, it says hello from the workshop. So great, that worked. It drafted that tweet for me. I could, of course, come in here and I could just publish this thing. Not going to do that though. Where are we at here? Let's also say send an email. We're going to say I want it to send an email for me. And let's see if this works. I have it connected to one of my Gmail accounts, so hopefully it'll send me an email from or to my actual master email. We'll see. So it says it's been sent. I'm gonna share it on the camera for those to see. Hello from the workshop. It worked. Just got it on my phone. So sent the email. Great. That works. The last thing, also you can see it has access to a whole bunch of GitHub tools. So let's say how many stars does the Mastra AI Mastra repo have? So this is going to go out to GitHub. It's going to pull out how many stars. We'll test how well GitHub caches. So if you want to go to the Mastra AI-AI/Mastra repo if you haven't already and give us a star, we'll run this thing again here in a few minutes and maybe we can get that bumped up a few more. So please go give us a star. But you can see it had access to all these different tools, right? It can do these different things. I can see all the different tools. I could test any of these tools in isolation if I wanted to. I can actually see what tool it called. So it called the search repository tool. It passed in this query and then it returned the content. It then took that content and it formulated the response and gave me the right answer. So you can see how you can pretty easily wire this stuff up. Obviously, we need to figure out how do we give our agent access to all these tools because we just added a whole bunch of functionality. It probably required a lot of code to do that, right? Well, let's take a look at it because it actually is relatively simple. So if we go to this agent and we go to this MCP agent, you can see the whole thing is 60 lines of code, so it's not too bad. There's actually a few lines in here that aren't even needed, so we don't even need those. So what we're doing first is we're creating an MCP client and we are connecting to Zapier, which I'll show you what that does. So again, I have this in my environment file. I got this URL from Zapier. I'll show you how I built that. And then we're connecting to GitHub's official MCP. So if you Google search GitHub MCP, you'll get information. And again, I just have to pass in my GitHub token, which is in this, in my environment file. So I have my GitHub token there, and that's how it knows what repos I have access to. So if we want to know how to set up Zapier, because if we look, there's a whole bunch of different tools down here. Zapier Gmail, and there's some Typefully, Zapier Typefully. So inside Zapier, if you go to Zapier MCP, you log in, you can create a new MCP server. So I created an MCP server. And if I were to click on here, it would give you that URL. I had to copy out. I'm not going to show you because it is a secure URL. You need to know that in order to access this specific MCP server. But I was able to just add tools, right? And I just OAuth to my Google, my Gmail. I OAuth to my Typefully account. And now through that, uniquely defined URL, my agent has access to be authenticated as me in these tools. So that is how, again, if I were to remove one of these and then I were to refresh, or I'd probably have to rerun the development server, then that tool would be gone, right, in the playground. So let me get rid of that one. So that's how it gets access, and you can see that it lines up with exactly those tools. And then the GitHub ones come from the official GitHub MCP. So we just gave our agent a whole bunch of functionality with basically a few lines of code. So we create the MCP client, we get the tools from that MCP client, and then I'm going to scroll down, we'll come back in a second, and we just then pass in all those tools. I could be more selective and only, I could specifically pick out which tools if I didn't want to give it every tool, but for now I just gave it all the tools from those MCP clients. We do set up, kind of basic memory, which we just pass in here. We're using GPT-4o in this model, and you can see my system prompt or my instructions, I guess, are a little bit longer. I tell it, I always find that you have the best results if you both give the tool with a good description and you guide it in the system prompt of when it should use certain tools. So I tell it how it can use Gmail, how it can use GitHub, and then how it can use Typely. When you're building agents, you will spend a lot of time iterating on this prompt. I know this seems like pretty basic. In this example, it is. But if you're actually productionizing an agent, a lot of times these system prompts will be hundreds of lines of written text, which is kind of challenging in a way because you need to speak to the models in a way that it's going to give the right responses, and how you structure this does sometimes give you different results, and depending on what models you're using. So there's a few questions here. Let's see if we can answer those. Um, Is the agent a React agent? Yes, it does like basically do the React agent loop that you'd expect if you look up what an actual React agent is. Can we upgrade the MCP example? Yes, you could do that. Mastra has a bunch of voice primitives. I don't know if this will actually work in here, but let's just test this. Um, let's try it. Let's allow. How many stars does the Mastra-AI/Mastra repo have? So obviously I didn't know exactly, what it is, and it doesn't have it doesn't have the voice back in this case, but we have those capabilities in Mastra. You can use like OpenAI's real-time voice. You wire up like 11 Labs or some other text-to-speech provider. I'm gonna assume this is cached because I know at least one of you went out and started this, I hope. So we're getting a cached response. Oh, and said my sound got a bit muted. Yeah, I do wonder, can you all hear it now or not? Here, okay. How about now? No? Now, maybe? Yeah, I wonder, you still can't hear me, I don't think. Now's better? Okay. All right, had to close the browser tab. So live demo, we broke it. Okay, so let's look at another example. This is a little bit more of a complicated agent, but it just builds on the previous example a bit more. So this one, you can see we have those original Gmail, GitHub, Typefully. We also gave it access to the weather tool. I gave it access to a Hacker News MCP. I gave it access to a Mastra workflow, and I gave it access to the file system, so it can actually write notes for me. So add a to-do note to call my mom today. So we'll see. This one is gonna read and write to my local file system, so it'll take a second for it to like process that. So the interesting thing is when you think about this, this is going out to, OpenAI. OpenAI is telling my system what it should do, and then it's going to it should write this note for me. Assuming I didn't break something in the live demo, and it actually works. It's taking a little longer than normal. But you can see it has this access to text editor to read files, read multiple files, write files, edit files. So it has access to those tools, has access to our GitHub tools that we had before. So honestly, this scares me a little bit. This has access to way more tools than I would typically give an agent. The more tools you give it, the more likely it's going to make a mistake in calling the correct tool. It has access to Hacker News and then our weather tool. But you can see it wrote a file. If I open this, I think there's a notes directory it has access to. Here's a to-do, call my mom today. So it just wrote that file. So great. We now have the ability to read and write files to the local file system. Tell me about the Hacker News article called A Course as an MCP Server. There's Abby. He's actually in the Zoom if you've seen him chatting around. All right, tell me about the Hacker News article called "A Course as an MCP Server." So this should go out to Hacker News. And this one's using. This is interesting because it's using a little bit different transport for MCP. Before we were showing going out to a remote MCP server. This is actually an MCP server that's running locally that then goes out to the Hacker News API. So it's a little bit different, but we posted this on Hacker News. It got quite a bit of traction. So you can see it gives me how many points, my username, all that. So it actually went out to Hacker News. So let's look at one more thing, and then we'll show the code of how this works. We also wired up a Telegram bot so I can chat with this local agent. The nice thing about this Telegram bot is I could chat with this now on my phone on the go. If I had this, I'd have to have this running on my computer because it does like pull in locally into this agent that's running. So let's just ask it, how many stars actually we'll ask it the weather. What is the weather in, we'll do San Francisco again. And so it's going to think, it's going to call this, it gives the weather. And so this should actually show up here, I believe. We'll see. What's the weather in San Francisco? You can see it comes from Telegram. So I can see that this is running locally. I can see what it actually resulted in. And you can see the value that it got. And it says this is the response. Gusting up to 8.6 kilometers an hour. That's exactly what the text is right there. So you can see I'm using Telegram as an example, but this could be any front end, right? This could be some kind of mobile application that calls into your agent. It doesn't have to be a chatbot. The chatbot is just like the easiest way to visualize how an agent can work. But a lot of people wire this up to different types of SaaS applications where maybe they click a button in the application and it triggers a workflow or a call to an agent. And so it doesn't have to be a chat interface. All right, so looks like thank you all for answering some of those questions along the way. That's great. Let's look at the code for how this works. We'll spend like 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll open it up for a few more questions. I did see, I think there's a couple other questions that have come in. All right, so I'm gonna answer these real quick and then we'll look at the code. How does Vercel AI SDK and Mastra compare? And what complexity does the switch to Mastra make sense? So Mastra is built on top of AI SDK. We do have a blog post to show you how our features build on top of AI SDK. So if you use Mastra, you are using AI SDK. So if you've already used AI SDK in a project, you can kind of add Mastra on top and then use pieces of it. Mastra gives you like more defined primitives for workflows and for agents and for agent networks. So it uses the model routing and the tool calling of Vercel's AI SDK, and it kind of gives you more structure. So if you're just making a simple single LLM call in an application, maybe Mastra's a little bit, you don't necessarily need Mastra for that. But if you do want to build more dynamic agents or more complex systems and you want the observability that comes with, with having like something like this playground. You want the local testing environment. If you're building something that's a little bit more complex, that's where Mastra starts to make a bit more sense. Does Mastra have Ollama adapters? Again, it's built on AI SDK, so you can use Ollama in other local models. Can you say that MCP is a collection of multiple APIs? It could be. It doesn't have to be, because again, we'll show like this local file system writing is actually an MCP server as well. So it doesn't always have to be, but I think that's the most common use case. Is there a way to tie Copilot Kit to Mastra workflows? Yes, there are ways to do that, and you can do like streaming workflows with Copilot Kit and AGUI. We do have some examples, and I think in the Copilot Kit docs, there's some Mastra examples for how to do that. We're still improving it though. We're working pretty closely with the Copilot Kit team because this idea of like connecting rich user experiences to like long running agent tasks like workflows is still a little bit uncharted territory. So we want to enable people to build richer UI and UX experiences. You can do it today, but there's still, in my opinion, more manual work than we want it to be long term. So that's getting better. Does the local LLM SDK you mentioned give you MCP tool access through any of the models? A lot of local models actually don't do very good with tool calling. Mastra has like a tool compatibility layer that helps some like Llama. Llama's kind of notoriously bad at calling tools, but we have a compatibility layer, so Mastra will actually like help make sure it can call tools correctly more often. It's still not perfect, but with Mastra and local models, you can access tools in MCP, depending as long as the model supports it. Wow, we had a lot of questions. All right. I'm trying to leave a few minutes to answer some more, but let's dig into some code. So I don't want to completely skip over seeing some of the code. So we got a question asking about the workflow. So we'll maybe take a look at that. So let's look at this person, but first let's look at the personal assistant agent. So in this case, we're still creating the MCP client. We are giving it access to Zapier, to GitHub. So this Hacker News, you notice how these are passing in a URL. These are remote MCP servers, either using streamable HTTP or SSE. Those are the two kind of transports that allow like remote access. This one's using command. What this means is this is running this local command. It's running what is just like an NPM package. So it essentially is downloading this local code, running it on my system. In this case, it just so happens that this code is calling some JavaScript that goes out to Hacker News' API. But I could actually like look at what this package does. There's another one, I guess, a file system. So it gives you basically CLI or command line tools that are actually running on my system, right? It downloads this package. It has tools that have access to my file system, and that's how it was able to write this node. So it doesn't have to be something that executes to some remote API somewhere. It could be something that just runs locally, and you want to give your agent access to command line tools on your system or on your server, right? Often I would, caution you that you might want to run this stuff in sandbox environments, not on your local system. We do a little bit more advanced memory. So we tell it how many of the last messages to use. We give it working memory, which means it tries to remember specific things. If I tell it my name and then I have 500 messages, but I ask it again, it will still like keep track of that. I think this is important information, this user information. These could be anything that your application deems important. We have a little bit longer of a system prompt here where we tell it about Hacker News, file system. We have this daily workflow. I will show you what that does. And we're passing in all the tools again, and we're passing in this Mastra workflow. So let's look at what this Mastra workflow does. I always like to start at the bottom of workflows. So this workflow doesn't need any input or output. And it's just called daily workflow. And it calls, first it does get Hacker News articles, then it summarizes Mastra PRs, then it combines the messages, and that's what it does. So if we look, this is going to be pretty simple. This first step that it calls, I'm just getting the Mastra agent and I'm passing in this prompt of fetch these articles, and then I call generate. If I were actually building this, I want it to be more reliable, I probably would just call the tool directly. I could use this exact Hacker News MCP tool and just call it rather than just having my agent do it. I was just kind of lazy and I knew my agent could do a pretty good job, but there's extra latency here, right? If I just called the tool and passed the response, I could make this a lot more efficient. And same with summarizing master PRs. I'm using the agent to go out and do this. So it's telling my agent decides to go call the GitHub tools for me. I should just more deterministically call those specific tools. But you can kind of wire this up. You have some flexibility. And then the combined messages just basically concatenates the messages and gives us one response. So if I go to the playground, still have that running, I think I do. I can go to my personal assistant and say, run my daily workflow. And it's going to call this workflow. And this is going to take a little while. So while this is running, I'll try to answer a couple questions. Can you dynamically build what tools are available? You can. The answer to that is yes, there's different techniques for doing that. You can kind of pass in, you can actually have a tool that can do dynamic things. You can pass in what in Mastra we call runtime context. So maybe like certain users of your application will have their tool will respond differently. Maybe you have a tool that gets content from a database, but depending on the user, you would retrieve different content, right? And then you can dynamically control to some extent like what tools you actually want the agent to have. So you can have this idea of dynamic agents. All right, so we can see the top Hacker News articles. We can see, oh, there looks like there was some kind of authentication issue. We're not going to worry about it, but you saw that I could get access to GitHub before. So I don't know why that didn't work this time, but maybe if I reran it, it would work. All right, so we went through a lot. I will say like deploying this is pretty simple. You can deploy to Cloudflare, Vercel, Netlify, a lot of different places. You can also deploy to Mastra Cloud. You can get to Mastra Cloud by going to cloud.mastra.ai. We're in beta right now, but it's very similar to if you use any of those other tools. You can commit your code to Git. You can connect your GitHub to a project, and you get, in this example, this is like a weather agent. You can see I can see the weather agent and chat with it just like I could locally. So I have basically the same playground experience in a cloud environment. And now I can access this through through the API. So I can talk to these agents. And there was a question on how to deploy long-running agents. There's you start to especially if you're using serverless deployment platforms, you can run into timeouts. So you need to be thoughtful around where you're deploying. Make sure that depending on how long these agents actually run, that wherever you're running can support that long running of a task. You can do it. You just kind of have to make sure you evaluate your platform where you're going to be deploying. Uh, okay, so I don't know if we're going to be able to answer all these questions. So these are really great questions. If we don't get your question answered, please go to our Discord. We'll try to answer some in there. We have a very active Mastra Discord. If you go to the Mastra website, find the Discord link, you can join there. All right. So let me go ahead and finish up a few things. We'll go through these last few slides, and I will stick around for another maybe 2 minutes if you do want to stick around and get some questions answered. So here is the Mastra GitHub. Please give us a star if you haven't already. Here's the access to this personal assistant agent that we just showed today. You can see how we wired up Telegram, all the stuff that we didn't have a chance to cover. Please connect with me on X or LinkedIn. And as I said, if you want to join Mastra Cloud, you can get into our beta. You can give us a star on GitHub, and that is it. All right, I'll stick around for a few more minutes and try to answer some questions. Thank you all for coming. I know some of you have to run, but I will try to get through some of these. Can you touch on what the state of the world is regarding agents with tool calling? I ran into a bit of an impasse when I was trying to mess around with things the other day, and it wasn't clear if this was a Mastra AI SDK limitation or Gemini, but it didn't seem possible to do both. So yes, if you want it, if you want to be able to make a call to an agent, have it return structured output, and then respond to that, you do potentially need to use experimental output. Matt, I'm curious on what errors you have. If you can come to our Discord, we can help you get that sorted. It should be possible. But there are some tricks to getting structured output to get returned with tools. But it is possible to do. Like I said, there's just a few things you need to potentially think about, or maybe there's some bugs too. It is possible. If you have a routing agent to other agents, do you also use that agent to generate the final response, or do you pass it to a separate agent? This typically you would, if you're building a multi-agent system and you want to have some kind of supervisor or manager agent that typically receives their first response, routes to others, and then formulates a final response. That's the most common pattern. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way though. Like you could wire it up in many different ways. Is Azure, OpenAI, and AI search supported? I believe if it's supported by AI SDK, which I think Azure is, it should be supported. Is Mastra looking at expanding the tooling of the playground, such as tracing into something more offered like link views, remote prompt management? The answer to that, Matt, is yes, we are working on it. That is more to come on that soon. How hard would it be to deploy a Mastra playground with some authentication like Clerk or other providers? Daniel, I don't know the exact answer. There's a few steps you have to do in order to get Mastra Playground deployed. If you do go through that process, we're happy to kind of provide some guidance and help, and then eventually we can provide some documentation so people in the community can figure out how to deploy the playground on their own. You can, of course, use Master Cloud as well, so you don't have to worry about deployment, and you can kind of have authentication and all that kind of baked in. Can I run any MCP server like Linear's MCP server with agents? Yes. Yeah, any MCP server should work. You can wire it up to agents. All right, so last thing, a couple thank yous. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for pasting the Discord link. Yeah, appreciate you all for sticking around a little late, and we will see you all hopefully at future events, future workshops. Come talk to us on Discord, and we will see you later.